Hi everyone, I'm Ali, I'm an architect, and today we're going to continue our breakdown of the ARB's Part 3 professional criteria. Today we're looking at PC4, practice and management, so let's go. Okay guys, if you haven't seen, then this is part of a series where we're breaking down all of the 5 of the ARB's Part 3 professional criteria. PC1, 2 and 3 are already up on the channel, so go check those out. Also, thank you everybody who's subscribed. We're over 200 subscribers, but 80% of people watching are not subscribed, so please do subscribe. It would be great. There's more really helpful stuff coming on the channel soon as well, and you can come join us in the chat and discuss the trials and tribulations of being an architect. Also, please do drop a like on the video if it's helpful, because it helps other people find it. And we're going to start with our breakdown of PC4. So what I do in these videos is we just go through the 10 subpoints of every professional criteria and just explain what they mean a little bit more clearly for people if you're not sure, and basically tell you whether or not I think you would be likely to already cover that in professional practice, so when you're working in an office, or if it's something that you more likely need to work on as revision for your Part 3, or that you'll get taught in your Part 3, or that you talk about in a study group for your Part 3. So yeah, let's look straight at 4.1. So 4.1 is the roles of architectural practice in the construction industry. As you'll see from PC4, like with a lot of the other professional criteria, it covers a lot, like a really broad range of topics, and it depends on what kind of practice you've worked in as to how you kind of interpret these and come across them. So the first thing to note is roles of architectural practice in the construction industry. Obviously there's like more than one, and it's a topic that's more kind of general, but also is asking you to understand like your awareness of an architect's position within like the system of a construction project. And obviously you will have awareness of this directly from working in the construction industry, and so you'll know like how your architecture practice figures in the construction industry, and probably be aware of how others are as well. The RIBA client handbook, which is something that I linked in PC2, I think, is linked below again, because it's quite good in talking about like larger clients and what they expect from architects and what architects do, kind of that role of overseeing the project and leadership, which is a kind of traditional position of an architect in a construction project. So it's also how architects interact with other roles in the construction industry and what those are, which kind of then reflects back on what an architect's role is itself. And architects are usually the first people to be appointed on a job, working with the client to develop a kind of strategic brief or feasibility of a project, and they're usually appointed for the longest period of time as well, overseeing the whole project, especially under like traditional procurement systems. So yeah, here a lot of this is kind of going to be anecdotal from your personal direct experience, and that's why Part 3 it's great to have a study group, because there'll be other people from different practices who've had a different experience, or even if they work in the same practice as you, they'll have come from a different background and they'll probably have a different experience of this than you, and it's just good to discuss that, and then you'll have a bit more of a broader interpretation of this topic. But you want to be aware of obviously architect, and then the other roles in the construction industry that I was mentioning, like structural engineers, quantity surveyors, M&E engineers, contractors, subcontractors, ecologists, planners, building control, project managers, clerk of works, roles like this, and then where they sit alongside an architect's role, which obviously can flex depending on what is included in an architect's appointment and what exactly the role is that they're carrying out. So it might be just architect, or it might be other ones of those roles as well included. So it's kind of a broad topic. There's a little bit of information below, but really this is something that you're going to know from what you have already experienced directly. And it's something I'm going to touch on in your Part 3 about understanding kind of more broadly an architect's role in the profession and what we want an architect's role to be in the profession and what they should be pushing for. Like obviously at the moment, specifically more sustainable construction is something that I believe architects should be pushing for. So things like that, like what their role is in driving design, and obviously there's a limited role in that in terms of like cost control, and architects not really being, they're not the client at the end of the day, but trying to push design towards like better design for the people they're building it for, but also for the environment and society in general. So this is kind of the role of architects directly in a job, and the role of them larger in society as well. Okay, 4.2 is external factors affecting construction and practice at national and international levels. So again, I think this is kind of self-explanatory, again, about practice and management. So it's basically at international levels and national levels. So it's being aware of legislation, politics, any regulatory changes that happen, including like the recent building regs regulation changes, recessions, possibility of recession. Construction is usually the first industry to suffer in a recession and the last to recover in a recession. So that's something to take into account there. Supply interruptions, which is something that we're also experiencing at the moment. Worker shortages, again, skills shortages, VAT, like VAT and value-added tax and its application or not. The economy in general, interest rates that affect how borrowing can be undertaken by either clients, developers, etc. The housing crisis itself is something that is like an external factor affecting construction and a push for certain construction. Whether that is then in the best interest long term of society or not is a different question. And then environmental legislation and ecology legislation, things like this. So anything that's external factors affecting construction and practice of architecture at a national and international level. So again, if you're working in a practice that does work at both a national, like UK level and international level, then you might be a bit more aware of this. If you don't, that's something that, again, great to do that through a study group and having somebody else who has that direct experience that can help you out with that. And really, it's keeping up on the news and being aware of what's affecting the construction industry from one point to another. I mean, I'd say sort of external factors affecting the construction industry now, legislation in terms of like the cladding crisis that's all come forth from Grenfell, the Grenfell Tower disaster. These are things that then is having an effect on developers paying for those changes or not paying for those changes and undertaking design in the future. And obviously that's all rightfully should be done. So it's like those are things that are a legislative change, but you know, they're really required in the construction industry. Same as the building regs changes that are affecting how you design something, but they should be made as well. And any forthcoming legislation that people are discussing about, anything that makes the market either uneasy or not, and therefore affects people's ability to deal with construction. Construction projects as well have a really long time span usually. And so interest rates, inflation, stuff like that really affects a construction project and its viability for the people who are either the clients or, you know, developers. So all those things are something to bear in mind. You will have experience of this from practice and just from working in architecture, whether directly or not. But again, you'll be taught it more during your part 3. And another way is obviously to have a study group with people with varied experiences that are different from yours, and then you can learn from them as well. So that is 4.2. 4.3 is practice structures, legal status and business styles. This is something that we have touched on before. I believe it was under PC1. But, you know, don't quote me on that. We should go back and check. But basically, this is kind of self-evident again of what they're asking for here. So in terms of in the UK, what are the systems that people set up businesses with? So sole trader, limited companies, partnerships, employee-owned systems, which have like a different internal structure. The legal status of those business types. So the difference between, for example, a sole trader and a limited business, and the protection afforded to people who are directors of a limited business, which are not applied to people who are sole traders. Things like this is something that you need to understand, and specifically in terms of practices of architecture. So the cooperative or employee-owned practice structure is something that's much more popular now. So being aware of that and the legal status it has and the way it affects the business style is another thing that is great to do. A lot of people who are working in practice are probably working for a limited company, but also great if you can see partnerships or understand how partnerships work, because it's probably the other most common type of architectural practice. And then maybe like, you know, cooperative or employee owned is maybe the next, because that is a definitely like sort of growth sector of architecture business, like practice structures. So these are things to be aware of. It's more like in terms of business structures of the UK and what's like acceptable, and then how different architecture practices use those and what kind of structures they're using, and look at some successful practices and the way that they're structured. This is a really easy way to kind of understand this. Again, you'll obviously have direct experience of this wherever you're undertaking professional practice, because it will be one of these types. And then a great thing to do is kind of critically analyse whether you think that's a good structure or not. The only structure I'd say is not great is a sole trader, because you don't have any protection as a sole trader. Basically, your own personal assets can be claimed as part of the business assets, and what a limited company does is basically break that. So yeah, don't set up as a sole trader is definitely my advice. But yeah, sort of again, very general, very general like business information that you need to know, and you will be taught it again at your part 3 in order to do your exam. But it's something that, like I say, you'll be aware of. So it's just really noticing that you know this and how it's affecting like the way the practice actually operates like day to day and what their business style is. Okay, so 4.4 is personnel management and employment related legislation. So again, this is quite self-explanatory, and you will have some experience of this probably from practice. Hopefully, if you're working in practice, you're paid and you have an employment contract. So obviously you can refer back to that in the first instance to kind of understand this. It's talking about human resources or HR, which in big practices, they'll have a dedicated HR department. Usually smaller practices, the HR is usually done by the directors or the main partners, depending on what kind of business structure it is, which we've obviously already talked about. So things that you need to be aware of here and learn, again, like I say, you'll be taught certain things of this in your part 3 as well, but it's kind of like the system that they use for HR, so how people are inducted when they start, employment contracts that they use, and all of that sort of thing, the sort of rights of employees in the business. And then things that are like standard in terms of employing people in the UK, like protected characteristics, for example, making sure there's no discrimination in anybody that you employ or between choosing people for employment and how they're protected, learning things like that. I'm not going to go into it like super detailedly, but basically it's the UK's general employment related legislation. It's not specific to architectural practice. Something that is interesting to look to in architectural practice is like the required number of work hours, the contract's position on overtime, things like this are like obviously endemic issues in architecture. So that's just something interesting to check in your own contracts. But yeah, it's having an awareness of that and how the business deals internally with issues, which is obviously what human resources is really doing, and how it approaches those and whether it's good at it or not. That's something, again, you can like judge based on your own personal experience, but you will be taught these topics for part 3 as well. 4.5 is practice finance, business planning, funding and taxation. So again, we're going to be super quick in this video. PC4 is probably the most straightforward maybe of all of these. So obviously this is again like the general finances of the practice and understanding how that works and understanding how you would run a practice in terms of finances. I've mentioned before the RIBA Financial Management Handbook. That's really useful for this, but it's things like billable hours, like how much of your time is actually billable, therefore what is your like projected income from that time, turnover, profit, overheads, etc. Just general business terminology and how that works, what they mean, and how you like balance a business's finances. Then the business planning, so short, long-term planning and how you're going to deal with risk and potential like market shocks, things like that. Again, they will touch on this in your part 3 in teaching you as well. Funding, in terms of whether you have investors or funders or, you know, private loans, things like that. These like how are you actually running your business? Really, you shouldn't be using loans. Hopefully, if your business is successful, you shouldn't need to use loans to fund it. But that kind of understanding how that works, and also like how investors, shareholders, etc., things like that might work. And then taxation on business, so business rates, VAT, corporation tax, PAYE, sorry, and like what is included in that, what the business pays for, things like pension schemes and stuff like that as well. So anything that generally affects the running of businesses and therefore the running of an architectural practice. Hi guys, so this is just me from the future here to tell you that unfortunately for the rest of the video, the audio and video desynced and it is a pain to fix it. So there is no video for the rest of this video. It's just the audio for it for 4.6 to 4.10 and a little bit after, a little bit of a summary. Hopefully that's still helpful to you. I'm so sorry and I will fix it for the next one. 4.6 is marketing, fee calculation, bidding and negotiation, and a few things that we touched on in the past have also mentioned these. So as we've said before, they kind of like overlap a lot of the time, the professional criteria. But marketing obviously is like paid for marketing, so social media campaigns, advertising in magazines and stuff like that, window advertising, any sort of billboards, anything like that, anything on like YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, all that kind of thing, and your website itself, maybe if it's redirecting people there. So it's like the costs of this as well, because obviously here we're dealing with practice and management, so like how you're projecting bringing work in and therefore what role marketing plays in that, and also how you're paying for marketing, so what budget you have for marketing too. So you're always thinking about the things in PC4 under like a business situation. Fee calculation, again, we've touched on this in the past, but like the time cost, the profit, any contingency that should be built into that, overheads, etc., that obviously you're covering in that, which we're going to cover in the next point as well, which is job costing. But basically fee calculation, how you're calculating a fee, so things like what is your hourly rate that you need to charge out yourself at or other people in your business at in order to cover the overheads and all the costs of the business. So things like this, again, you'll be taught part 3, but it's something that if you're working in practice, especially practice that will let you see how they calculate these kind of things, it would be great to get first-hand experience of it because it makes it a bit easier to understand yourself. So bidding, again, is kind of interlinked with this. It's terms of like planning bidding, like programming, like when work is going to happen and how long it's going to take, whether you're bidding for like work that is competitions and things, or whether you're bidding for like you're submitting fees for private work as well. But what happens if all of those jobs come off and then you have to program them in, or what happens if none of them do? So things like this in terms of business planning and actually like projecting what's going to happen. And negotiation, which we've talked about in previous videos, are just about working out what kind of costs you can do something for, and then profit like margins on that, and whether you can then drop that or not, how you get to a point where you and a potential client are happy with what you're paying, and that making sure it does actually work for your business. Because again, as we've mentioned in the past, the ARB Architects Code actually enshrines that an architect needs to make sure their business is actually like working and that it's like has longevity, basically, that it's going to continue making a profit and it's going to survive. So you can't underbid on continuous things, because that's going to endanger your business itself. And then potentially, obviously, anybody who works for you as well. So it's kind of understanding all of that in a business situation and like projecting and making sure that you've considered these things. This is something that you probably don't have direct experience of, and you will be taught in your part 3. And obviously it's something that generally you can read about as well. But it is something that if you can speak to somebody at your practice and see if you can understand how they do it, why they do it like that, and what information they actually have and what they've worked out, then that will make it a lot easier to understand how it applies specifically to that business. Okay, so 4.7 leads on from this quite well. That's resource management and job costing. So again, what I was saying there in terms of like bidding, like how you bid is probably more relevant to 4.6, and 4.7 is like resource management. So do you have the people to actually run this job? And if you don't, do you need to hire new people? In which case, is the job actually priced high enough, or is it not going to cover the cost of those new people coming on board? So all these kind of things are like just business things, really, making sure that the business is like a legitimate, like profit earning business. And so it's the time planning, the people, how much they cost the business and how much they're charged out at, and whether they're billable people as well. So obviously architects, part 1s, 2s and 3s, they're all like they're all making money because they're producing drawings. Whereas you might have human resources staff or other staff like that are technical, that don't necessarily get charged out the same way. They're non-billable staff. So it's learning the difference between those things as well, because then they have to be covered, because they're not bringing money into the business, they're just making the business work. And job costing as well. So what I touched on previously in the business planning fee calculation, all these previous terms in PC4, is job costing, and making sure that the cost that or the profit you're going to get on the job, or the costing of the job, is basically works out financially, to make sure that what you're charging at least covers your costs, if not also making you a profit. And yeah, to make sure that the way that you've costed it takes into account all of these things, so that you've worked out like an hourly rate that covers like your overheads and also includes for like wages and everything, and profit and things like that. So that's another whole video if you want to go into that, but that's basically what it means. It's all about running a business and having a successful business is really PC4. 4.8 is administration, quality management, QA, systems, recording and review. So this was the one specifically, 4.8, that I had less sort of experience of, specifically for my first time I did my part 3, but then a little bit also the second time. So I did a lot of learning about PC4 from my study group too. Just because the first practice I was in was very small and I didn't really understand some of these things. And then larger practices have a lot of these systems in place. And so it was kind of like, I didn't really understand how it worked. Basically, it's a lot simpler than it sounds like it is. So QA systems is quality assurance systems. The RIBA has their own kind of suggested systems for that you can download off of their website. But really, it's like how jobs are run and the administration of like running jobs in a business, architectural jobs, but also how the business itself administers itself and where it stores things, how things are kind of tracked, all that kind of stuff. So filing systems and processes, you will be aware of this from working in practice if your office has a specific system of how you store, name and like distribute drawings, like having proper drawing registers every time things are issued, and how you kind of manage when things were issued or not, all that kind of thing, tracking that then can be applied to invoices and stuff as well. So all that kind of thing. Then quality management and other QA systems, you can have like specific systems for this that are more specialized. So ISO literally developed standards for this. So like the ISO 9001, which is like a quality assurance system, is kind of like something that larger practices use, and smaller practices often model themselves on those systems, even if they're not like ISO accredited, but they're kind of like best practice ways of doing things. So yeah, the ISO 9000 series is like the quality management series, and you might see other things. So bigger practices are often like registered with the ISO in terms of like they're accredited by them. So ISO like IEC 2701 2013, security for digital information, or other ISO standards such as 4001 is like environmental management systems, and making sure that you improve the environmental performance of the business itself, and how it does things. So all of these are kind of quality management QA systems. QA systems apply, obviously the RIBA's ones are about how you run a job and make sure that the quality is consistent across every job that you run. Recording and review. So again, this is you'll have had like personal appraisals probably in all of your workplaces you've ever had, but also in terms of a job, recording, reviewing it, how well it went, things you could improve with it, speaking to the client at the end and getting feedback about how they think the whole process was, how the communication was specifically on the job too. And then obviously in the case of individual employees as well, so appraisals, recording, review, and then details of how they could improve themselves or things they might want to do, training they might want to focus on, etc., etc. So it's all just kind of that thing. There's a load more detail about it. I will link some of the ISO stuff below so you can kind of see that, because working in a smaller practice, that was the stuff that I wasn't really sure about. But the RIBA's quality assurance systems for jobs, they're as good as well, so I'll put those below as well so you can have a look at that. Okay, then 4.9, kind of again following on from the previous one quite well, staff development, motivation, supervision and planning. So we're talking about recording and review in terms of both jobs, but also in terms of staff members. Obviously, this is looking at the same thing. So staff development, we know that CPD is required under, well, it's kind of, it's like you need to stay up to date on things, is in the architect's code, but CPD requirements in terms of time are in like the RIBA's professional standards as well. So they need like 35 hours a year for that. So CPD, continuing professional development, is part of staff training, software training as well, specialisms such as like heritage specialisms that you need to go away and have specific training for, so you understand what you're doing on those. Whether you have staff heading up different departments and how many departments you have, whether you're like specializing in certain things or certain kinds of architecture. Again, depending on what kind of practices you've worked in, you might work in ones that are specialist in certain kinds of architecture and they don't do other kinds of work. So if it was like education sector or healthcare and things, a lot of practices focus quite heavily on those and they don't do so much of other things, and they certainly usually won't do things like private residential client stuff at the same time, because you've spent a lot of time and money, like, you know, specializing in that and also getting your staff to specialize in that. Then motivation, obviously this is something that you'll have a personal opinion of working in architecture, and what, you know, what you feel like the practice life is like, what the kind of ethos of the practice that you work at is like. And if you've worked at multiple practices, the difference between those. Another great reason to work at multiple practices, to see how this is different across like different practices and different size of practices as well. Then supervision and planning. So what is in place in terms of the hierarchy of the practice, who's in charge of resourcing and how people are distributed onto jobs, who's in charge of making sure that those staff are kind of on certain deadlines or are producing the work that they need to be, or if they have any questions, answering those questions. What's the kind of internal hierarchy system? How are they kind of like appraised at intervals? How are they kind of given feedback, etc., and how like planning in terms of the resourcing itself, how are you putting your best people where they would be best? So it's kind of like playing to people's individual strengths as well, and you have to understand those obviously in the first instance in order to be able to do that. So it's kind of a bit, it's just business management really, and understanding how you run a business, what your business is going to be specialized in, and then how you would adjust or deploy your staff in order to like benefit that system, which you'll have experience of directly from professional practice. You'll have your own opinions of from professional practice, and again you'll be looking at some of this in your part 3, but it's a great thing to have a study group and talk to your study group about their individual experiences, whether they had bad experiences and moved practice or whether they think their practice is amazing. It kind of depends. And you can also look at things like the AJ 100, which looks at 100 practices and their internal ethos, how that works and how the staff feel about working there as well. So that's 4.9. Okay, and the last one for PC4 is 4.10, which is team working and leadership. Kind of, again, like all of PC4, kind of self-explanatory. You obviously know what this means, but it's terms of like management, targets, long-term planning. Again, teamwork and leadership and how you worked in a team or how the leadership worked and whether there was, proper organization on a project is something that's great to talk about in your PEDR. Whether you stepped up yourself to lead certain aspects of a project or lead a project, and how you felt supported or not by your practice to do that, whether they're kind of encouraging you into leadership positions when you feel that you can do them and giving you enough support to do them as well, is something that's you're going to have direct experience of. And so again, you're going to have your own personal experience of what is good team working and what is good leadership. And depending what kind of practice you're working in, you'll have different experience of these too. If you're working in smaller practice, the team working is more, you're usually working less people on more types of jobs. So you might not be working across with many people. And then if you're working in massive practices, you might have a team of like 8 to 10 people or even more that are all working on like the window schedules, all the details and stuff all at the same time. So the team working is kind of different. It's another reason why I think it's great to have different sizes of practice in your experience, so that you see how you fit in those places and whether you do or not, whether you enjoy it. But it's still really great for your experience to see how different kinds of practices run different kind of jobs. But that's kind of it for 4.10. It's pretty self-explanatory. That's what it means. So you need to have your own experience here to understand what you think works for people and what doesn't. And obviously, again, understanding that people are different and different people want different things from a workplace or expect different kind of setups. And different people will thrive in different settings. So it's not necessarily that they're bad at something, it's just the way that it works doesn't work for them. So understanding all of that, and you'll be taught it a little bit more specifically in terms of what's expected at part 3, like what you should be doing as best practice. But I think there's no substitute really for having your own opinion about it based on what you have done yourself in professional practice, which you should certainly have. And definitely something that's great for your part 3 as well is the fact that you're going to be asked to reflect on your experiences in practice. So having an opinion on what you've done, and how you think it went and how you think it specifically worked for you or not is just great thoughts to be having now, and then recording ready for your part 3, and it'll influence your understanding of all of these things. Okay, so as I've said, guys, that's kind of PC4, that's the breakdown of the 10 points. PC4 is very sort of general, and it's also quite self-explanatory. One of the great things with PC4 is to look here at the header of what they're asking you to do. So it's trying to make sure that you understand business priorities, and what is like required management and processes, the risks for architectural practice of running jobs, and the risk of running an architecture practice itself. Risk, as I've said in the past in different videos and maybe in this series, is that risk is a major part of your part 3 and your approach to risk and how you manage that. Again, keeping in mind that you need to be, if you're like a director of a business, and also if you're following the ARB's architects code, you need to be making sure that business is sustainable, and therefore not taking unnecessary risks with it. And yeah, basically the relationship between a practice of architecture and the construction industry more broadly. So these things that they ask in the top header, really important to check that always as well in regards to all of the 10 sub-points. Obviously we mentioned that in the past, but worth mentioning again. And it's saying that you'll have the skills to engage in business administration, and you can resource and plan and implement a job. So a lot of the time, again, you'll be asked to do that for your part 3. They want to see how you would like assign people, how you would manage time. Okay guys, it's me again because of the audio issue. I'm back to do an outro because I completely lost that footage. So thank you for watching. I'm sorry that these have been delayed. There's a lot of life stuff that we were going to at a different point, but hopefully PC5 should be with you soon, and I hope PC4 was helpful. I'm sorry about the video issue because it's a lot more boring, even more boring to listen to it if it's just audio. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you. I can give you some updated numbers that we have more than 300 subscribers, which is insane. If this video, even without the video, was helpful, please drop a like on it because it helps other people find it. And the PC5 one will be with you as soon as possible. And I'm sorry that they are taking a while. Thank you for sticking with me, guys, and hopefully things should be a bit more chill in the near future. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, guys. Hi, everyone. I'm Ali. I'm waiting for the camera to look normal.